Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Hourlings Podcast Project. My name's Martin Wilsey and I'm your host. Tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do a top 5 countdown. And for tonight, I'm going to turn hosting duties over to Shay. She's going to drive this bus.
My ultimate plan to be an authoritarian dictator has succeeded, and I have usurped Marty in this podcast. So yeah, I was tasked with identifying the top 5 subgenres in fantasy, because fantasy is a huge umbrella and a lot falls under it. So these are my top 5. After lots of staring at my phone, I have figured it out. And we're all going to debate and see if we agree with this list and talk about what we think about it and if we've written in it or read about it and what you should know about it. So coming in at number 5.
Oh, sorry, that was too soon probably.
Magical realism. Now, magical realism is fantasy which takes place in a modern, often suburban or rural setting. Ordinary characters encounter something a little unusual. Maybe magic, maybe not. But it's there and it's not going away. Sometimes characters learn to work with it, other times just to live with it. The extraordinary thing can be central to the story or periphery to it. And some examples are Field of Dreams or Big Fish. So, Hourlings, what do we think about magical realism?
Well, I'll start off. I've actually read lots of books that have magical realism in. And now I think it's really important that you can, put a border on it, because otherwise you're going to end up with so many subgenres. Because like Harry Potter technically fits in this category, but then Harry Potter technically fits in a whole bunch of categories. I really enjoy the story where just a little bit of magic happens over the edge, or an artifact gets found that has a magical property or something like that. It's very common, very good, and I can see why it's on the top 5.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely it can be a cross between contemporary and literary with magic, like just a hint of it. And you're right, it can be very subtle, like even like, the question of, is it a mental illness or is it magic? That also oftentimes comes into magical realism.
Yeah, I was just thinking, for instance, it's almost on that border between fantasy and mainstream, where it's a little bit of magic, but not too much, not enough to take you far into the fields of fantasy if you're not a fantasy person, but enough to dip your toes in the water. And
in that way, it might be a stepping stool or a stepping stone for readers to bridge their way into fantasy if they're more used to literary mainstream.
I think it can also be a tough sell sometimes. Yep. Because having written some magical realism, not intentionally, but it's where I ended up. Stories become what they want to sometimes. I have one story that classifies as magical realism, and it's been a tough sell because it's so much different from all of my other stuff.
Right, which is more traditional fantasy, right, or heavily fantasy. Yeah. Jeffrey, what were you going to say?
Well, I mean, I was just going to point out something like Raiders of the Lost Ark is a very good example of that magical realism, because most of the movie is just like, imagine yourself in the 1930s, and then, of course, the ark opens up, and then magical realism.
Sure. I'll tell you what I think is one of the best book-to-film adaptations I've ever seen, and I would call it magical realism, is Holes. Have you guys seen Holes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Lewis Schaefer. That is a fantastic story that weaves in so many different plot lines. But I would definitely call it that magical realism because it has to do with the curse, that goes back to the 1800s, and, a lot of stuff going on there.
So that was a great book. I read that when my kids read that book at school. And I enjoyed the hell out of that book, even though I was not the intended audience.
For sure. All right, any other thoughts before we go on to number 4? Let's do it. The audience is waiting. All right, coming in at number 4, Paranormal. This is fantasy which incorporates subhuman creatures, such as vampires, werewolves, ghosts, and witches. Frequently pairs with romance. Examples are Twilight and The Sixth Sense. What do we think about paranormal?
I always find that particular topic very fascinating. It does key in with something that is a very subgenre-y of that historical paranormal fantasy, like my story Cross Duty, which is zombies versus Romans. I think that those tropes of vampires and zombies and mummies and all that are classic, but sometimes overused, and that's the danger. Twilight, for instance, overused the concept of werewolves and vampires, such to the point that we got saturated with them. So, to a point, I will say, yes, it is a good genre, but too much of a good thing.
And that's why it's number 4, not number 1.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of object. I scratch my head and go, paranormal? It seems almost like a subgenre of urban fantasy to me.
Yeah, it depends on how you address it.
Yeah, but almost every urban fantasy assumes that werewolves and vampires and things that go bump in the night are real as well. What seems to have taken over the paranormal field is a lot of paranormal romance, more emphasized in that, I guess, subgenre than say urban fantasy itself.
Yes.
Your mileage.
Yeah, I have an outline for a haunted house novel that I'm looking forward to writing at some point this year if I keep going at the pace I'm rolling. And I think that's square in the paranormal area. You look at all the novels that Stephen King has written in the paranormal vein, and I see that. I actually consider talking about paranormal to be more like those, and the werewolves and vampire thing, it actually lands in urban fantasy in my reading history more so.
Now, one way that I might object to that, but both David and Murray's point of paranormal being a subset of urban fantasy, is that I think urban fantasy has to have systems of either magic or explaining certain races like werewolves and vampires and how they operate.
I'm not saying that it's a sub of urban fantasy. I think paranormal is a subgenre in its own. I'm just saying that the crossover is very common for urban fantasy with vampires.
Gotcha. Yeah. Then in that case, I'll shift my argument to being supportive of your point then. In that I look at The Sixth Sense, for example, which I think is old enough now that I can do the spoiler, that the therapist the whole time was a ghost. But there's no need in that story to explain the world of ghosts or how ghosts work. He just is a ghost. And it seems like the fantasy is more contained to the characters, and then they interact in a more mainstream world. So I can definitely see that being on its own. But as we go through this list, I think you'll find that we are leavening out the contemporary world more and more as we go into this list. So the number 1, I think, will be very telling of that. So
I also get the impression, before you move on, that on the one side, paranormal sometimes crosses over with urban fantasy. On the other side, perhaps it edges into horror as well with some of the fantastic elements. And I would bring some of Stephen King's stories into the paranormal realm if they've distanced themselves a little bit from horror.
Yeah, it's all about style in that case. There's definitely a lot of Halloween characters that come into play in paranormal. So I agree. All right, coming in at number 3, steampunk. Fantasy that is often set in Victorian or Edwardian themed worlds and marries magic with industry. Strongly calls on adventure and discovery. Example, Leviathan. This is one of my favorite subgenres.
Yeah, me too. I love reading that stuff. I've never attempted it. I enjoy reading it, and I love steampunk movies.
Yeah.
Everything from H.G. Wells on. It's
totally.
J'adore Jules Verne. I love Jules Verne.
I read Bone Shaker. I don't know if you've read that. That's probably my favorite steampunk novel. Very cool. I think
one reason that steampunk is so well received is because it really does call on those traditional adventure stories, like Call of the Wild, like Treasure Island, which may not exactly be steampunk, but if you were to incorporate a little bit of magic into any of those stories, it'd be perfectly fit to the steampunk genre. So it has a lot of nostalgia to it.
Well, it also is often set in Victorian times. So not only does it bring in the adventure, but it also brings in some familiar tropes with regards to the comedy of manners,
Right.
the noble adventurer, the
Right.
heiress who's locked into a path that she doesn't want, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
There's a lot of that built into it as well.
But I mean, that's
All that plus corsets. Gotta love it.
And
Well, I
top
mean,
hats.
but that's the beauty of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, is that they were not writing steampunk intentionally, but they were setting the precedent of steampunk because of the era they were writing within. But I mean, I love how we've developed it. In fact, my story, the automatons, that was just published in our most recent anthology, Black Market. That story is steampunk in space. The idea that you could run a spaceship with solar sails and steam, and clockwork droids that were very similar to the droids in the Doctor Who episode Girl in the Fireplace.
And Jeffrey, I think that actually plays into a point I wanted to make with steampunk, is that it often centers around transportation or some sort of mode of transportation, be it a submarine or a very strange air transport of some sort, some kind of Zeppelin.
I love dirigibles. I love
Yeah, some kind of dirigible,
Yeah.
train, steam trains.
submarines. 20,000 leagues under the sea. I love that.
Right, exactly.
What about the gadgetry, where the gadgets could be neat guns or vehicles or flying vehicles or things of that. You got to have the gadgets too. But
Yeah.
interestingly,
Jetpacks.
I don't think steampunk has really hit the mainstream audience. It's doing fairly well in literary form, but it certainly has not hit the mainstream with regard to, like, shows or movies on some of the streaming channels or movies in general.
And
I
maybe
remember that. Well,
ahead.
I'm going to say thank you, Shade, but because I was a big fan of, and I really miss The Secret Adventures of Jules Verne. It was a neat little show that was on one of the minor broadcast television stations. It was perfect. It was steampunk. It was Jules Verne and Phineas Fogg and all that stuff. That was just a great adventure.
And maybe that's why steampunk is only number 3 on our list, being that it's kind of kept its cult following and not really hit mainstream. But I think we are getting to the point of being debatable, since we all seem to really like steampunk a lot, and maybe our viewers feel the same way. I actually have written in steampunk. My 5th novel was called Emporium, and it was a trilogy, set in Victorian era England, and definitely calling on adventure. They lived in a world where almost all the wild animals had gone extinct, and hunters that went out to capture the very last animal of that species and display it in a zoo called the Emporium were very much glorified in a very adventurous, hypermasculine type macho, big white hunter themes. And so that definitely was my beginning with loving steampunk. But there's a lot of good stuff out there, so take a look at it. Let's move on, though, to number 2 on our list. Number 2 is urban fantasy. Fantasy that takes place in a city or gritty contemporary world. Magic often hides behind the political or the shadowy. Example, the Dresden Files. I know that this is a popular one among you guys, so what do we think about
I
number
love
2?
the Dresden Files. I've read every one of those books in that series, and there's a lot of them. I lost count a long time ago.
Yeah, and one of our author friends, Jeremy, he does a great job of putting demons and orcs and everything into the modern environment. Hint: goblins are lawyers, which is a great way of
put a pinstripe suit on any character, dwarf, goblin, elf, and there you go. You got urban fantasy.
He's a very good writer, Jeremy Holloway. Check him out.
David, you're on mute. Welcome to 2021.
Still having trouble with technology. What can I say? Feeling like a Luddite right now. Now I lost my train of thought.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll take it away from you then.
Yeah.
Urban fantasy. I think one of the things, it's important to remember, there was no such thing as urban fantasy before the late 80s, early 90s. So it is new, and I think the reason for its popularity is that it mixes the strange and unusual with the contemporary environment that people know. And so there's this feeling to it that you too could bump into this this other world. Perhaps if you find the right portal, or you're in the right place at the right time, maybe you too could stumble into this world beside our world.
And how does that make it different from our number 5 and number 4, which also mixed contemporary worlds with a little hint of magic?
Well, steampunk, I think, is sort of a world in which the contraptions of Michelangelo and Jules Verne and H.G. Wells could be true, and it's about gadgets and the Victorian age. And so you almost never.
I think the setting is different because urban fantasy is usually contemporary times in modern cities, or urban areas of one type or another.
The historical, right?
Steampunk.
Yeah, but I didn't say steampunk. I didn't say that though. I said 5 and 4, which is magical realism and paranormal. How is it different from that? I can definitely say how it's different from steampunk, but that's a thinner line: magical realism and paranormal.
Well, I think aspect to urban fantasy as well. Lots of the stories featured characters with unique powers, dealing with not just the mundane world that everybody knew, but also otherworldly creatures as well. And for the first time, and remember, science fiction and fantasy before about 1970 was pretty much a man's world. So urban fantasy, there's a lot of empowering stories about women being the heroes, and I think that was a new to people as well.
I think one of the main things that sets apart urban fantasy and magical realism and paranormal is that I think the city itself really becomes almost a character in the story. Even like Gotham City, if I can use that as an example. I know it's a little bit more dipping into superheroes and all, but the city environment really becomes part of the atmosphere, and I think that's a necessary differentiating factor.
The Marvel universe, you could argue that it is urban fantasy.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
The whole X-Men thing, that you could argue that that's urban fantasy.
Right, exactly. I agree.
I think you're crossing into science fiction, but
yeah, I know. But the thing is you could have science fiction elements in urban fantasy as well.
That's true. Yeah, it definitely is the closest one, I would say, to those two very big genres.
Right.
Yeah. I started working on my next novel, which is a time travel novel that takes place in Richmond, Virginia in 2010. That kind of fits the urban fantasy setting, criteria. If you are gonna pigeonhole something, I never identify what it is until I'm finished writing it. But that's possible.
That's also you don't see a lot. You don't see a lot of time travel plot lines in fantasy worlds. It's not something I haven't seen. The Magicians did it, and so I have a couple other stories, but it's very uncommon, time travel and fantasy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a medieval setting with time travel is sort of like, I went back 10 years, everything's exactly the same. I went back 100 years, everything's exactly the same.
Well, look at Dragon Riders of Pern. That's kind of a medieval setting. It's got both science fiction components as well as time travel in it.
It does.
But I don't call that urban fantasy. That may be the next.
I would call that pretty hardcore science fiction. The only thing that they wave their hands at is how the jumping and how the teleportation and time travel works. But it's consistent and definitely science fiction in my mind.
Sure. All right, let's get a drum roll for number 1. Yes. Number 1 is high fantasy. Fantasy that involves epic sagas, entirely fictional worlds, a system of magic, and is often complete with classic features such as pre-industrial technology and elves, dragons, and dwarves. Example, The Lord of the Rings. All right, so does this deserve the number 1 spot? Is it too obvious?
I love high fantasy.
Well, I think if
really
you
do.
look at popularity, it is definitely a contender.
Yep.
I think that there is so much high fantasy out there, and I think you can measure genres by how much is out there that's really bad, because there's a lot of really bad high fantasy. And trust me, I've read a lot of it because I like high fantasy so much.
Right.
And I think when people think fantasy, they think of high fantasy. And I think
Yeah.
that's why it deserves the #1 spot.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
I agree. The subgenres below that are very in minute ways compared to how big high fantasy is.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, the thing is that if you write high fantasy, be very mindful of a certain litigious former writer. Do not encroach on hobbits. You will get sued by the Tolkien estate. Be mindful. Write your own fantasy. Make your own world. Don't use everything that Tolkien did.
What,
This is your world.
does he own hobbits? Did he make up hobbits himself?
Yeah.
I
Yes.
think Hobbits is trademarked.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And
That's
why would you want to, bogart that anyways?
I
Yeah.
get it. Yeah.
Especially when you can make up your own word.
Yeah.
Sure.
D&D has halflings.
Halflings,
Right.
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 They had to differentiate from hobbits because they, I believe they did get in some trouble for that.
Yeah. Well, I love high fantasy too. I think every aspiring fantasy author has tried to make their own world and draw their own map, and have these interesting country names and interesting races that they are going to include in their fantasy novel. So I definitely enjoy this genre very much. I do have an unpopular opinion, which is that I often make the argument that Game of Thrones is not high fantasy, or is not as high fantasy as others are, because of how closely it parallels the continents on Earth. You have a very clear Westeros being England, and a very clear is it the Dothraki being the Mongols. Just very, very close parallels. So if that's high fantasy, I'll let you have it, but I don't have as much respect for the world building in Game of Thrones that I do for things that really just go out of nowhere and have a really imaginative continent. What do you guys think about that?
I think Game of Thrones is high fantasy. It's not anything else.
Yeah.
Many
I haven't
books
found anything. I'll keep looking.
model their maps based on reality. Lord of the Rings did.
Yeah. More Lord of the Rings. What?
Definitely did. And,
That was supposed to be.
What did he
Earth.
model it on?
well, it was Europe and England, and further west out towards Mordor or towards USSR.
Yeah.
Oh my.
He
I didn't know that there was
I mean,
such political
Tolkien,
undercurrents.
when he got back from World War I, he was really kind of busted up by that experience, and that's where the whole concept of Mordor came from.
Really? Wow, I
is
didn't know
the-
that it was so
The
politically
battlefields
charged.
that he suffered in World War I. Trench
Yeah.
warfare is a nightmare.
Oh,
Right, right. Yeah.
And
Huh.
he wanted England to be Hobbiton, clearly.
Wow.
The green fields of, Hobbiton, and
Mhm.
so
Interesting.
he,
I didn't know any of that.
there's books written about the parallels that he has with everything,
Wow.
location wise. And in fact, if you just bring up the map of Middle Earth and overlay it on top of a map of Europe, it's
Yeah.
pretty close.
Interesting.
Oh,
I never saw
It
that.
was always his intention. It was.
I
always
will
his
say that
intention.
the best, so maybe that's just my personal taste in high fantasy, that I prefer worlds that don't so closely relate to our world. But I think for my taste anyway, the best high fantasy examples I've seen are in video games, such as the maps and worlds of the Elder Scrolls, the maps and worlds of World of Warcraft. Totally out of left field, really difficult to identify earthly comparables to those worlds, which I think is very impressive.
Yeah, I can remember as a kid reading Lord of the Rings, and was so excited reading Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara theories. Everybody, you know, a lot of people were too cool for school, were saying, oh, it's just a ripoff of Lord of the Rings. No, it's the same genre. It's like, this is a new genre. Welcome to the new genre.
Right.
And it was good. It's not like nobody's ever going to use elves and dwarves again. It's
Well, yeah, elfy wealthy fiction, as they call it, has sort of fallen somewhat out of favor with the publishers. And that doesn't mean it's not a good market for indie publishers, because quite frankly, the traditional publishers are not serving it well now.
Yeah, I think you see a lot of mass market paperback in this genre more than any other as well. You know, you can go to your local bookstore and there's shelves and shelves and shelves of high fantasy pocketbooks, as they call it.
I haven't seen the bookstore since like February.
Yes, of course. All right, so that is our top 5 list of fantasy subgenres. But wait, there's more. We have an honorable mention that did not make it on the list, but we had to talk about it. And that is going to be called number 6, fairy tale / folklore and retellings. And this is fantasy that is told simply and with a moral. Usually has strong ethnic and cultural atmospheres, sometimes done as a retelling with a modern twist and younger or more diverse characters than were originally. Happy endings expected. And one example would be Cinder, a young adult novel that retold Cinderella, as many have. So what do we think about fairy tales and folklore and their retellings?
Well, you know, I will say this, the red book of fairy stories and the green book of fairy stories, those classic bindings of the Grimm fairy tales and all that stuff in itself, the classic stories, which do not often end happily, are
true.
what I prefer.
There are some unhappy endings.
Yeah.
Maybe the happy ending is the lesson that you learned, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the retelling of the fairy tales, that's been happening for decades. They'll take a story and just use the theme, if nothing else, and camouflage it in a new plot, new characters or whatever, with the same exact moral, the same exact outcomes and stuff. How many times have we seen Beowulf as a plot? It's happens a lot.
Or The Lion King as Hamlet.
Yeah. Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
Retold and retold again, or whatever, you know.
Right. And even then, when Shakespeare wrote it, it was a retelling of a story that already existed.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, folklore and fairy tales are like the relics of fantasy that have been passed down for a very long time. And there definitely was a phase, I think it was after Twilight, when teens were just, you know, craving more angsty romance, where they moved on from paranormal and started to do retellings with teenagers falling in love, usually in film. But I remember like Beastly was a film about Beauty and the Beast, but instead of it being, you know, a kind of bearish, wolfish figure, it was a young man covered in tattoos and piercings, and just a very modern, contemporary type telling of it. Not that tattoos and piercings are bad, I should say that, but that's what it was. So yeah, so that definitely has gone through many lives, many lives. What's the difference to you between fairy tale and folklore?
Well, a fairy tale is usually what we think of as like Grimm's fairy tales, or the kind of G versions of those that maybe we encountered as kids. But when you start talking about folklore, you also get into legends and tales,
which some people still believe that is real.
Mythology.
Right, I think that's the difference. Folklore, it tends to be more cultural or ethnic.
Right.
Historic record. I hate to say it's history, but when you hear
there will be
folklore about Paul Bunyan or about any other topic, it's dramatically different than fairy tale.
There could be some little old women in the country that believe that this is totally true.
Yeah, my good friend just made a film about Sasquatch, about Bigfoot. I mean, You know, it's a whole other thing. And I can tell you, those wee beasties that they sell on the banks of the Loch, I mean, of course, you know, there's no evidence, but of course, if you believe in the Loch Ness Monster, you believe in it.
Yeah, that's true.
A great example would be American Gods, which is currently a big popular series on television that you can binge watch if you like.
Or our local folklore, the Bunnyman Bridge, you know, which is we're all from Virginia, Northern Virginia, so you know, that's our local haunted place.
Wait a minute, I haven't heard that story.
You have what?
I have not heard that story.
Oh.
Yeah, Google is your friend, pal.
Yeah,
Bunnyman
or
Bridge.
DuckDuckGo.
What is
Which
it?
I use now. Anyway, so that is our list of top 5. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope to
By
do
the way,
more top 5s in the future. So
I just want to say one last thing for the record of the thing. That may be a nice bridge, but this bridge that I'm standing on right here, looking at Neuschwanstein, that's Marianusbrug. So bridges, man, bridges.
Bridges to the next episode. Take care.
See ya,
next
and
week.
that's another finely structured episode.